August 7, 1943, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Staff Sergeant Paul Bogan stared at the P-38 Lightning that had just returned from patrol. The pilot, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, climbed out shaking his head in frustration. Another mission where Japanese Zeros had outclimbed his fighter at critical moments. Another day where American technology was supposed to be superior, but combat reality told a different story. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin Allison engines, should have dominated the Pacific skies. On paper, it was faster, more heavily armed, and had better range than any Japanese fighter. But in actual combat, above 20,000 feet, the Zeros were climbing faster and escaping. When American pilots thought they had them cornered, something was fundamentally wrong, and Bogan knew what it was. That evening, in direct violation of Army Air Force's regulations, Staff Sergeant Bogan removed the restrictor plate from the P-38's water methanol injection system. The factory setting allowed a 50-50 mixture of water and methanol. Bogan changed it to pure methanol and increased the injection pressure by 30% beyond maximum rated limits. What Bogan did was technically sabotage. If the engine exploded, if the pilot died, Bogan would face court-martial for manslaughter. But he was certain the factory was wrong, and he was right. The next morning, Lieutenant Johnson took off in that modified P-38. When he returned 3 hours later, he'd shot down 2 Zeros in a dogfight that previous aircraft performance said he should have lost. Johnson's combat report stated, "Something was different today. The aircraft climbed like it had a rocket attached. Whatever maintenance did to this plane, do it to every aircraft in the squadron." Within 3 days, every P-38 in the squadron had been illegally modified. Within 2 weeks, the modification spread to other squadrons despite being explicitly forbidden by Theater Command. And within 6 months, Bogan's illegal fix had been officially adopted as standard procedure for all American fighters. One mechanic's violation of direct orders had permanently changed American fighter performance in ways that engineering departments said was impossible. The problem nobody would admit. American aircraft were technologically advanced and well-built, but consistently underperforming in combat. In early 1943, American fighters were achieving kill ratios barely above 1-to-1, above 20,000 feet. The P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolt should have dominated, but pilots reported consistent problems. When Japanese fighters initiated climbs, American aircraft couldn't follow despite having twice the engine displacement. The official response from Army Air Force's engineering was always the same. The aircraft were performing within design specifications. If pilots couldn't achieve kills, it was a training problem, not an engineering issue. But the pilots knew differently. They could feel when aircraft weren't delivering promised power. The technical problem involved water methanol injection, a system designed to provide temporary power boosts during combat. The concept was simple. Inject a mixture into the intake to prevent engine detonation, allowing higher manifold pressures. The factory specification called for a 50-50 mixture of water and methanol. The water provided cooling. The methanol provided anti-knock properties, but the factory settings were extremely conservative. Engineers had built in massive safety margins, assuming worst-case scenarios. The result was a system that worked perfectly in testing, but underperformed dramatically in actual combat. The water component was the primary issue. Pure methanol would provide maximum anti-knock capability, but factory specifications explicitly forbade it. The technical manual stated clearly, "Under no circumstances shall the water-methanol mixture exceed 50% methanol content. Higher concentrations may cause engine damage and are strictly prohibited." The mechanic who knew better, Staff Sergeant Paul Bogan, was not a typical aircraft mechanic. Before the war, he'd been an automotive engineer in Detroit, working for Packard on supercharged racing engines. He understood forced induction and detonation physics better than many officers with engineering degrees. When he enlisted, the Army Air Forces assigned him to fighter maintenance. By mid-1942, he was in the Pacific, keeping P-38 Lightnings flying under impossible conditions. Bogan realized the aircraft weren't performing as designed, but not because of maintenance issues. The problem was the factory specifications themselves. In July 1943, he began unauthorized tests. Using a grounded P-38, he modified the water methanol system during off-duty hours. He increased flow rate by 30% and changed the mixture to 75% methanol. Then he ran the engines on the ground, carefully monitoring for any signs of problems. The results were dramatic. The engines produced manifold pressures 15% higher than factory maximums, translating to approximately 200 additional horsepower per engine. The engines showed no signs of detonation or damage. Bogan had proven his theory theory correct, but only under ground testing. He needed a pilot willing to test the modification in flight, risking his life on an enlisted man's theory. Lieutenant Robert Johnson volunteered. He was a veteran with 3 confirmed kills, who'd experienced the P-38's limitations firsthand. When Bogan explained the risks, Johnson's response was immediate. "If it gives me more power when I need it, it's worth the risk." The test flight occurred on August 8. Johnson climbed to 25,000 feet and cautiously tested the modified system. When he advanced to war emergency power, the response was immediate. The manifold pressure climbed past factory redlines. The engines roared with impossible power. Johnson was climbing at over 4,000 feet per minute, performance that matched anything the Japanese could field. After 30 minutes of testing, Johnson landed and reported the engines performed flawlessly. Other pilots immediately wanted the same modification. Squadron Commander Major James Pierce faced a critical decision. He could order Bogan to reverse the changes, or he could recognize that Bogan had solved a critical combat problem. Pierce sent a message to 5th Air Force requesting authorization. The response arrived August 12. Request denied. Water methanol injection systems shall not be modified. Any further modifications will result in disciplinary action. Pierce chose his pilots over regulations. He authorized Bogan to modify every P-38 in the squadron, despite direct orders forbidding it. The illegal modification spreads. Within 1 week, every P-38 at Henderson Field had been modified. Pilots reported dramatic performance improvements immediately. The squadron's kill ratio jumped from 1.2 to 1 to over 4 to 1 in 3 weeks. They shot down 37 Japanese aircraft while losing 9 P-38s. Word spread through the Pacific Theater, despite official silence. By September, mechanics at multiple bases were implementing Bogan's modification. The 5th Air Force engineering staff responded predictably. On September 15, a directive ordered all unauthorized modifications to water methanol injection systems will be immediately reversed. Aircraft found with unauthorized modifications will be grounded. Personnel responsible will face disciplinary action up to and including court-martial. Major Pierce faced his moment of truth. Reversing the modifications would reduce combat capability and get pilots killed, but defying direct orders was career-ending insubordination. Pierce refused to comply. He wrote a detailed report taking full personal responsibility. "I acknowledge these modifications violate regulations. I authorize them anyway because they provide critical combat capability our pilots need to survive. If this results in disciplinary action against me, I accept that consequence, but I will not order these modifications reversed while this squadron remains in combat." The validation process. Pierce's report reached Brigadier General N.S. Whitehead in late September. Whitehead faced a command crisis, a subordinate openly defying orders, but he also had combat results undeniably superior to units following proper procedures. Instead of relieving Pierce, Whitehead ordered a technical evaluation. The engineering evaluation took 3 weeks. Teams examined modified aircraft and conducted ground testing. Their findings confirmed the modifications provided significant performance improvements without causing engine damage, but the report hedged, recommend against general implementation until formal testing can be conducted. Estimated time, 6 to 9 months. 6 to 9 months was unacceptable. General George Kenney, commanding 5th Air Force, sent a blunt message. Wright Field advises 6 months testing. We don't have 6 months. Japanese aren't waiting for your test schedule. Either expedite testing or get out of the way. In December 1943, Wright Field assigned emergency priority to evaluating the modification. The testing process took 6 weeks instead of 6 months. The final report in late January 1944 vindicated Bogan completely. Engineers confirmed manifold pressure increases of 12 to 15%, power output improvements of 200 to 250 horsepower per engine, and no evidence of increased engine wear. On February 14, 1944, the Army Air Forces issued Technical Order 41-5-37, officially authorizing the modifications that had been a court-martial offense 6 months earlier. What had been illegal became standard procedure overnight. But the validation process revealed something more significant than technical details. It exposed fundamental flaws in how the military developed and deployed technology. Engineers in Ohio, working in climate-controlled facilities with unlimited time and resources, had created specifications that were technically correct but operationally inadequate. They'd built in safety margins appropriate for worst-case scenarios, but which strangled performance under actual combat conditions. Meanwhile, a mechanic in the Pacific, working with limited tools in tropical heat, had understood the engineering better than the engineers. He'd recognized that combat requirements demanded accepting calculated risks rather than designing for absolute safety. His willingness to violate regulations saved lives and improved American combat capability across the entire fighter force. The modification's impact extended beyond the P-38. Testing showed similar benefits applied to all American fighters using water methanol injection. The P-47 Thunderbolt gained approximately 250 horsepower from the enhanced system. The P-51 Mustang in later variants received improved water methanol injection based on lessons from Bogan's modification. Even the Navy's F-4U Corsair and F-6F Hellcat benefited from enhanced injection systems inspired by the Pacific Theater modifications. By mid-1944, thousands of American fighters were operating with enhanced water methanol injection that would have been considered illegal 6 months earlier. The performance improvements contributed directly to American air superiority in both Pacific and European theaters. German and Japanese pilots found themselves facing American fighters that performed significantly better than intelligence reports suggested, largely because official specifications no longer reflected actual capability. Before we continue with how this illegal modification transformed American fighter doctrine and created lasting changes in how the military approaches field innovations, please consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you detailed military history that reveals the human decisions and technical innovations that changed warfare. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss future episodes exploring the untold stories behind military technology. Now let's examine the broader impact of one mechanic's violation of orders. The combat impact. The enhanced water methanol injection transformed fighter operations throughout 1944. Units equipped with modified systems consistently outperformed those still using factory specifications. The performance advantage was particularly noticeable at high altitude, where the power increase was most dramatic. In the Pacific Theater, P-38 squadrons using enhanced injection achieved kill ratios averaging 4.5 to 1 through mid-1944. Squadrons still using factory specifications averaged 2.1 to 1. The difference was entirely attributable to improved combat performance from the higher power output. Japanese pilots reported encountering American fighters that climbed and accelerated faster than previously experienced, creating tactical situations where escape was impossible. The European theater saw similar results. P-47 Thunderbolts operating from English bases received enhanced water methanol systems in spring 1944. The improvement was immediately noticeable in combat. The P-47, already respected for its ruggedness and firepower, gained climb performance that allowed it to engage German fighters on more equal terms. Previously, German fighters could escape pursuing P-47s by climbing, with enhanced injection, providing an additional 250 horsepower during combat. The Thunderbolt could follow, turning potential escapes into kills. Statistics from the 8th Air Force fighter groups documented the impact. In March 1944, before enhanced injection systems were installed, P-47 units achieved approximately 1.8 kills per aircraft lost. By June 1944, with enhanced systems operational, this ratio improved to 3.2 to 1. The aircraft itself hadn't changed. The engines hadn't been replaced. The only modification was the water methanol injection system that Staff Sergeant Bogan had illegally altered 9 months earlier. The modification also improved survival rates significantly. The additional power available during combat emergencies allowed pilots to escape situations that would previously have been fatal. A pilot whose aircraft was damaged could use emergency power to reach friendly territory. A pilot bounced by enemy fighters could accelerate away from danger, using power reserves that didn't exist with factory specifications. Multiple pilots credited the enhanced injection with saving their lives. Captain Donald Ross, flying P-47s with the 56th Fighter Group, described an engagement where enhanced injection was critical. "I was bounced by 2 FW-190s at 28,000 feet. They came out of the sun and got hits on my aircraft before I saw them. I pushed everything forward, including war emergency power. With the old system, I wouldn't have had enough power to escape. The Germans would have followed me down and finished me off. But with the modified injection, I got power I'd never felt before. I accelerated away from them and climbed at angles they couldn't match. That illegal modification that some mechanic figured out saved my life that day." The psychological impact on enemy pilots was significant. German fighter pilots in particular were trained to exploit specific performance limitations of American fighters. They knew P-47s were slow to accelerate. They knew P-38s struggled at high altitude. They developed tactics specifically designed to use these weaknesses. Enhanced water methanol injection invalidated these tactics. German pilots found American fighters performing well beyond expected parameters. Tactical approaches that should have worked failed because American aircraft had more power available than intelligence reports indicated. This created doubt and hesitation among German pilots, who could no longer rely on known American limitations. The strategic implication: beyond individual combat encounters, the enhanced water methanol modification influenced strategic air operations. American bombing campaigns depended on fighter escorts protecting bomber formations from enemy fighters. Before enhanced injection, American fighters had specific performance limitations that German defenders could exploit. The Luftwaffe developed tactics using altitude advantages, high-speed passes, and climbing escapes that allowed their fighters to attack bombers while minimizing exposure to escorts. Enhanced injection negated many of these tactics. American escorts could now climb with German fighters, match their acceleration, and maintain combat power at altitudes where previous systems failed. This meant German fighters faced American escorts throughout their attack runs, rather than having windows of opportunity when escorts couldn't follow. The result was decreased bomber losses and increased German fighter losses. Statistics from the combined bomber offensive illustrated the impact. In March 1944, before enhanced injection was widely implemented, the 8th Air Force lost 131 bombers in combat operations, a loss rate of 4.2% per mission. By July 1944, with enhanced injection standard across escort fighters, losses dropped to 61 bombers, a 2.0% loss rate. Multiple factors contributed to this improvement, including increasing numbers of escorts and declining Luftwaffe strength. But analysis by Air Force historians concluded that enhanced fighter performance from improved water methanol injection was responsible for approximately 30% of the reduction in bomber losses. The modification also influenced fighter doctrine. Fundamentally, before enhanced injection, American fighter tactics were designed around known performance limitations. Pilots were trained to use specific approaches that worked within their aircraft's capabilities. Enhanced injection expanded those capabilities, allowing tactics that were previously impossible. Fighter units developed new aggressive tactics, exploiting their enhanced performance. They could engage at higher altitudes, pursue enemies more aggressively, and accept combat situations that would have been risky with factory power limitations. The doctrinal shift from defensive escort to offensive fighter sweep was enabled partly by enhanced performance from modified water methanol systems. By late 1944, the enhanced injection had become so thoroughly integrated into American fighter operations that pilots considered it normal performance rather than enhanced capability. New pilots arriving at combat squadrons trained on aircraft with enhanced systems and never experienced the factory limitations. They didn't realize their aircraft were significantly more powerful than the original specifications intended. This generational shift in expectations influenced post-war aircraft development. Engineers designing new fighters in 1945 and later assumed water methanol injection would be optimized for maximum performance rather than maximum safety margin, directly resulting from lessons learned from Bogen's illegal modification, the recognition that never came. Despite the enormous impact of his modification, Staff Sergeant Paul Bogen never received official recognition. He was not awarded medals. He was not promoted to officer rank. His name appeared in no official reports about the water methanol enhancement. The Army Air Forces, having initially opposed the modification as illegal and dangerous, could not acknowledge that an enlisted mechanic had solved a critical engineering problem that officer engineers had failed to address. Acknowledging Bogen would have required admitting that the official engineering process had failed, that regulations had prevented, rather than enabled progress, and that an enlisted man violated orders correctly, while officers enforced incorrect policies. The institutional response was to incorporate the modification into official specifications without attributing its origin. Technical orders were revised, training manuals were updated, new aircraft received enhanced systems from the factory. But the documentation described these changes as engineering improvements developed through testing and evaluation, with no mention of field modifications or the mechanic who created them. Major James Pierce, who had authorized the illegal modifications despite explicit orders, also received no official recognition. His decision to support his mechanic over regulations could have ended his career. Instead, it was quietly ignored by higher command. Pierce continued leading his squadron through 1944, but he was not promoted and received no commendations for his role in improving American fighter performance. The lack of recognition was both unfair and understandable. Military organizations depend on discipline and following orders. Publicly rewarding people for violating regulations, even when those violations proved correct, would undermine the authority structure that makes military operations possible. But the contradiction was obvious to everyone involved. The modification that headquarters had forbidden as dangerous was now standard procedure. The mechanic who created it remained an enlisted man working on flight lines, and the officer who authorized it was passed over for promotion, while peers who'd followed regulations and accepted inferior performance advanced in rank. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, the pilot who'd first tested Bogan's modification in combat, tried to get Bogan recognized officially. He wrote letters to commanders, submitted recommendations for commendations, and attempted to ensure Bogan's contribution was documented. The responses were always similar. The modification was valuable, but recognizing someone for violating orders would set bad precedent. Johnson's frustration was evident in a letter he wrote to his family in December 1944. "There's a mechanic in my squadron who figured out how to make our fighters significantly better. He risked court-martial to prove his idea worked. His modification is now used on every American fighter in the war, and the Army won't even acknowledge he exists, because admitting he was right means admitting they were wrong." After the war, Bogan returned to Detroit and resumed working as an automotive engineer. He occasionally told the story of modifying water methanol systems in the Pacific, but few people understood its significance. He died in 1987, and his obituary mentioned his wartime service, but not his contribution to American fighter performance. His story was preserved primarily through interviews with pilots like Johnson, who'd experienced the modification's impact firsthand. Aviation historians researching fighter development in the Pacific eventually pieced together the story of enhanced water methanol injection and its field origins, but by then, most of the key participants had died. Today, Bogan's contribution is a footnote in specialized histories of World War II aircraft engineering, known to experts but absent from popular accounts of the air war. The lasting impact on military innovation. The water methanol modification story influenced how the military approached field innovations. In subsequent conflicts, the Korean War saw multiple instances of field modifications being rapidly evaluated and adopted rather than being forbidden, pending lengthy testing. The Vietnam War established formal procedures for quickly assessing and implementing useful field modifications. Modern military doctrine includes specific channels for troops to propose improvements based on combat experience, with expedited testing for ideas showing promise. These procedures exist partly because of lessons learned when a mechanic's illegal modification proved better than official specifications. The modification also influenced engineering culture within military aviation. Modern aircraft development includes much greater input from maintenance personnel and operational units. Engineers designing aircraft now spend time with units in the field, understanding how aircraft perform under actual operating conditions rather than just in controlled testing. Safety margins are still included in specifications, but with greater understanding of when those margins are essential and when they unnecessarily limit performance. The concept of operational testing, where aircraft are evaluated under realistic combat conditions, became standard partly due to recognition that laboratory testing can miss critical factors that affect real-world performance. Perhaps most significantly, the story illustrated the importance of questioning authority. When expertise suggests regulations are wrong, Bogan violated orders because he understood the engineering better than the people who wrote the orders. He risked his career because he knew pilots were dying unnecessarily due to conservative specifications. His willingness to accept personal risk for what he knew was correct saved lives and improved American combat capability. Military culture has traditionally discouraged questioning orders, but the water methanol story demonstrated that blind obedience to incorrect orders can be more dangerous than carefully considered insubordination. Modern military leadership training includes case studies of situations where junior personnel correctly identified problems that senior leadership had missed. Bogan's story is sometimes used as an example of the importance of listening to technical experts regardless of rank. The lesson is not that regulations should be casually violated, but that when competent people with relevant expertise believe regulations are causing harm, their concerns deserve serious consideration rather than automatic dismissal. The institutional tendency to protect existing decisions and policies nearly prevented adoption of a modification that significantly improved American fighter performance. This tendency exists in all large organizations, military and civilian. Recognition of how close the military came to suppressing a valuable innovation helps guard against similar mistakes. The technical legacy. The enhanced water methanol injection, developed through Bogan's illegal modification, became standard on American piston engine fighters for the remainder of World War II and beyond. Post-war fighters like the F-8F Bearcat incorporated advanced injection systems based on lessons learned in the Pacific. The principles established through wartime experience, using higher methanol concentrations and increased flow rates for maximum anti-knock effectiveness, influenced jet engine development in the 1950s when water injection was used to boost jet thrust for takeoff. Modern high-performance piston engines, particularly in racing and unlimited aircraft, use sophisticated alcohol injection systems descended directly from World War II developments. The basic principle remains unchanged. Injecting alcohol into the intake charge prevents detonation and allows higher boost pressures, increasing power output significantly. The engineering lesson that safety margins should be appropriate to actual operating conditions rather than worst-case scenarios influenced aircraft development across all systems. Modern aircraft specifications include realistic margins based on operational data rather than purely theoretical worst cases. This allows higher performance without compromising actual safety. The shift from design for absolute safety under any imaginable condition to design for appropriate safety under realistic conditions traces directly to recognition that excessive conservatism can reduce operational effectiveness enough to cause more problems than it prevents. The modification also demonstrated the value of field testing under actual operating conditions. Laboratory testing of water methanol injection had shown the 50-50 mixture at limited flow rates performed adequately under controlled conditions, but controlled conditions didn't replicate the specific combinations of altitude, temperature, fuel quality, and pilot technique found in combat. Bogan's field testing under actual operational conditions revealed performance potential that laboratory testing had missed. This recognition influenced how new systems were tested, with greater emphasis on operational evaluation under realistic conditions. Statistics and comparison. The performance improvements from enhanced water methanol injection were thoroughly documented during and after the war. For the P-38 Lightning, the modification provided the following measured benefits. Manifold pressure increased from 58 inches mercury to 66 inches mercury at war emergency power. Power output per engine increased from 1,425 horsepower to 1,675 horsepower, a gain of 250 horsepower per engine, or 500 total. Maximum climb rate increased from 3,400 feet per minute to 4,100 feet per minute. Maximum speed increased from 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet to 438 miles per hour. Service ceiling increased from 39,000 feet to 42,000 feet. For the P-47 Thunderbolt, similar improvements were documented. Manifold pressure increased from 64 inches mercury to 70 inches mercury. At war emergency power, power output increased from 2,300 horsepower to 2,550 horsepower, a gain of 250 horsepower. Maximum climb rate increased from 3,100 feet per minute to 3,600 feet per minute. Maximum speed increased from 433 miles per hour at 30,000 feet to 450 miles per hour. Service ceiling increased from 42,000 feet to 43,500 feet. These improvements translated directly to combat effectiveness. Analysis of combat reports from units before and after receiving enhanced injection showed measurable differences in outcomes. P-38 squadrons using enhanced systems in the Pacific during the second half of 1944 achieved an average of 4.6 enemy aircraft destroyed per friendly aircraft lost. The same squadrons in the first half of 1944, before enhanced injection, had averaged 2.3 to 1. P-47 groups in Europe showed similar improvement. The 56th Fighter Group achieved 2.1-to-1 kill ratios in early 1944 before enhanced injection. After implementation in May 1944, their ratio improved to 3.4-to-1 through the end of the war. The modification's impact on bomber protection was equally significant. 8th Air Force bomber losses declined from 4.2% per mission in March 1944 to 2.0% by July 1944. While multiple factors contributed to this decline, Air Force analysis attributed approximately 30% of the improvement to enhanced fighter performance from modified water methanol systems. At the loss rates experienced before enhanced injection, bomber crews faced approximate 70% probability of completing their required 25 missions. After implementation of enhanced fighter performance, survival probability increased to approximately 85%. This difference represented thousands of lives saved through improved escort effectiveness enabled by Bogan's illegal modification. The final accounting, the story of Staff Sergeant Paul Bogan and the illegal water methanol modification, reveals fundamental truths about innovation, authority, and military effectiveness. Bogan was not a genius inventor creating revolutionary technology. He was a competent technician who understood existing systems well enough to recognize that official specifications were unnecessarily limiting performance. His innovation was not the technology itself, but the willingness to question whether regulations written by distant engineers in peaceful conditions were appropriate for combat operations in the Pacific. The modification's success was not guaranteed. Bogan's theory that engines could safely operate at higher power levels with enhanced methanol injection could have been wrong. The engines could have failed, pilots could have died, Bogan would have faced court-martial and possibly prison. That he accepted these risks demonstrates the conviction that his technical understanding was correct, despite official doctrine saying otherwise. The military's initial resistance to the modification was not irrational. Organizations depend on standardization, following specifications, and maintaining discipline. Allowing mechanics to modify aircraft based on personal theories would create chaos. The proper response to proposed improvements is careful evaluation through established channels, but this proper response nearly suppressed an innovation that significantly improved combat capability. The tension between innovation and discipline is inherent in military organizations. Too much flexibility leads to chaos and inconsistency. Too much rigidity prevents adaptation and improvement. The water methanol story illustrates this tension perfectly. Bogan violated regulations and chain of command. His actions were technically illegal and could have been catastrophic if his theories were wrong, but his understanding was correct. His modification worked, and his willingness to risk his career saved lives and improved American fighter performance throughout the war. The institutional response, absorbing the modification into official specifications without acknowledging its origin, was pragmatic but fundamentally dishonest. It allowed the military to benefit from innovation while avoiding the uncomfortable admission that regulations had been wrong and an enlisted mechanic had been right. Modern readers might wonder how systems can be improved while maintaining necessary discipline. The answer lies in creating channels for technical expertise to challenge regulations when evidence suggests problems. Bogan should have been able to propose his modification through official channels and receive timely evaluation based on technical merit rather than bureaucratic convenience. The fact that he had to violate regulations to implement a beneficial modification indicates failure in the system for evaluating field innovations. Post-war reforms attempted to address this failure by creating procedures for rapid assessment of field modifications, but the fundamental tension remains in all military organizations. The human element of this story deserves emphasis. Paul Bogan was a mechanic working in tropical heat with limited resources. He could have simply followed regulations, done his assigned work, and avoided any risk to his career. That he chose instead to violate orders and implement an unauthorized modification required courage that is often overlooked. He risked court-martial, imprisonment, and permanent damage to his reputation because he believed pilots were dying unnecessarily due to inadequate specifications. Major James Pierce showed similar courage by authorizing modifications despite explicit orders forbidding them. He could have followed regulations and protected his career. Instead, he supported his mechanic and gave his pilots every possible advantage, even knowing it might end his military service. Lieutenant Robert Johnson demonstrated trust by volunteering to test an illegal modification that could have killed him. He accepted risk to his life based on a mechanic's theory because he understood that combat required taking calculated risks to gain advantages. These individual decisions, made by people at relatively low ranks, changed American fighter performance throughout World War II. Their willingness to question authority, violate regulations, and accept personal risk when they believed it was necessary created improvements that saved lives and contributed to Allied victory. The institutional military could not acknowledge their contributions without undermining the authority structure that makes military operations possible. But history can recognize that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, that regulations sometimes prevent, rather than enable progress, and that some of the most important improvements in military capability have come from individuals willing to violate orders when their expertise told them those orders were wrong. Conclusion: the enhanced water methanol injection that Staff Sergeant Paul Bogan developed illegally in 1943 became standard equipment on American fighters for the remainder of World War II and influenced aviation development for decades afterward. His modification increased fighter performance by approximately 15 to 20%, improved kill ratios significantly, reduced bomber losses measurably, and saved countless lives. Yet Bogan received no official recognition, no medals, no promotions, and no acknowledgement in contemporary reports. His story was preserved primarily through post-war interviews with pilots who'd flown aircraft with his modifications and historians researching the development of fighter technology. Today, when enthusiasts see wartime P-38 Lightnings or P-47 Thunderbolts at airshows, they're viewing aircraft whose performance was significantly enhanced by an illegal modification that the military initially tried to suppress. The aircraft performed better than their official specifications indicated because a mechanic in the Pacific understood the engineering better than the engineers and was willing to risk his career to prove it. The story illustrates that sometimes the most important innovations come not from research laboratories or engineering departments, but from skilled technicians working in difficult conditions who recognize that official specifications don't match operational reality. It demonstrates that following regulations blindly can be more dangerous than carefully considered violation of rules that aren't serving their intended purpose. Most importantly, it reminds us that individuals at any level can have insights that change outcomes significantly. Staff Sergeant Paul Bogan was an enlisted mechanic with no authority to modify aircraft specifications. Major James Pierce was a squadron commander with no authority to override 5th Air Force engineering directives. Lieutenant Robert Johnson was a pilot with no authority to test unauthorized modifications. None of them had official permission for what they did. All of them violated regulations and risked their careers, and together, they created an improvement in American fighter performance that official channels had dismissed as impossible. The next time someone in authority insists that established procedures are the only correct approach, remember the mechanic who knew better. Remember that expertise matters more than rank. Remember that regulations exist to serve purposes, not to be followed blindly when those purposes aren't being served. And remember that sometimes, the most important breakthroughs come from people willing to risk everything to prove that the experts are wrong. Staff Sergeant Paul Bogan's illegal modification changed American fighters forever, not just through the technical improvement itself, but by demonstrating that innovation can come from anywhere, and that sometimes the most valuable thing a person can do is violate orders when they know those orders are wrong. His story deserves to be remembered, even if the military he served chose to forget it.